It's been more than 2 years since Russia unlawfully and forcefully invaded Ukraine. Since then, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO for short, has been trying to gauge the best response to the atrocities taking place in Ukraine. For the most part, NATO's initial response left much to be desired, from entirely standing on the sidelines so as not to provoke an all-out war in Europe, to a series of half-hearted measures and ineffective sanctions. Many of NATO's indecisive actions have only emboldened Russia. But now the time for hesitation is over, and NATO is well aware of it. Russia mustn't be allowed to win at any cost, and NATO must be the one to make sure of it. But why? Why is it so crucial for NATO to stop Russia, and why now? These are just some of the questions that we'll answer in this video, so stick around. Let's start with the why part of the titular question. Why must NATO stop Russia? The first answer that should come to mind is the sheer moral imperative. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR, 10,582 civilians lost their lives in Ukraine in the first 2 years of the war. Another 19,875 have been injured, with the OHCHR specifying that the number could be even higher. During the same 2 years, 31,000 Ukrainian troops have been killed defending their country, according to Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. US estimates paint an even grimmer picture, putting the number of Ukrainian soldiers killed at 70,000, with another 120,000 injured. And that's just by August of 2023, not even 2 full years since the invasion started. As a result of heavy shelling and fighting, an estimated 3.7 million Ukrainians have been forced to abandon their homes and are now internally displaced, while another 6.5 million people have fled to neighboring countries like Poland, Hungary, and Moldova, as well as other nations worldwide. Given the severe hardships many Ukrainians faced during these horrific years, it's no wonder these figures are so high. The findings made public in the April 2023 hearing before the US House Committee on Foreign Affairs titled "Exposing Putin's Crimes: Evidence of Russian War Crimes and Other Atrocities in Ukraine" paint a chilling yet undeniable picture of just how much devastation Russia has unleashed on Ukraine. Civilian buildings have been bombed mercilessly, despite housing children or the elderly. Innocent Ukrainians who've been executed have been either dumped in the streets or half buried in mass graves. Ukrainian prisoners of war have been beheaded. Numerous journalists, civil servants, and even everyday people have been abused in makeshift torture chambers using inhumane techniques like waterboarding and electric shock. Russian missiles have even hit funeral processions for those killed in this senseless war. Many of the people who have stayed in Ukraine despite the constant terror are living in damaged homes or buildings and lack basic resources like food, water, and medicine. That's why the UN Refugee Agency estimates that as many as 14.6 million Ukrainians need humanitarian help in 2024 alone. These incredibly disturbing facts and figures beg the question: how long will NATO allow this slaughter to continue? If nothing else, the alliance has a moral obligation to prevent Russia's historic war crimes in the heart of Europe. Of course, as important as morality is, it's far from the only reason NATO must act. The war in Ukraine isn't a war about territory, resources, or economic gain. It's a war about the very existence of sovereignty, democracy, and the right of a nation to determine its own future. And this doesn't just apply to Ukraine. At the present moment, Russia threatens much more than just Ukraine. It also threatens the neighboring nations, the rest of European NATO members, and let's face it, the entire world. But let's focus on Ukraine first. After all, this is the country that's been directly subjected to Russian aggression and has borne the brunt of its devastating consequences. What are the existential stakes for Ukraine as a country if Russia prevails? It's simple, really. If Russia wins, Ukraine will cease to exist as we know it. This means the erosion of Ukraine's independence and sovereignty, potentially leading to further territorial annexation. Russian control would undermine Ukraine's democratic institutions and freedom of choice in international relations, imposing a geopolitical shift that could reverberate across Eastern Europe and beyond. Moreover, a Russian victory would likely result in ongoing instability, insecurity, and humanitarian crises for the Ukrainian people, jeopardizing their future as well as the integrity of the nation itself. It's also highly likely Russia will continue with its dehumanizing brutality and violence that will crush the Ukrainian spirit once and for all. After all, that's Russia's modus operandi: seize a territory and erase the national and ethnic identity of its people. Just take the Crimean Tatars as an example. Following the annexation of Crimea in 2014, Russia has systematically targeted the Crimean Tatars, subjecting them to oppression, forced disappearances, and restrictions on their cultural and religious rights. As leaders of Crimean Tatars told the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Russia has eviscerated Tatar culture and language. In numerous Russian-occupied regions, people are denied healthcare unless they acquire a Russian passport. This pattern of erasure and suppression serves as a disturbing preview of what could happen on a larger scale if Ukraine were to fall under Russian control. But as we've already mentioned, stopping Russia isn't only a matter of saving Ukraine. It's about saving the entirety of Europe and possibly the world. You see, Russia's invasion of Ukraine shattered the fragile post-Cold War peace in Europe. In just 2 years, it became abundantly clear that Russia can only spread conflict, chaos, and suffering wherever it goes. It's also become clear that Russia has no intention of stopping. It can only be stopped. Otherwise, an emboldened Russia will likely continue to wreak havoc on Europe and the world, looking to establish a new world order dominated by authoritarians. Sure, from this perspective, the prospects for a long-lasting peace seem rather dim. However, even temporary peace is better than the path of carnage Russia might choose if it wins in Ukraine. If Ukraine falls, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are probably next. They'll soon be followed by other nations bordering Russia. Then, other Eastern European nations will come under attack. And then, who knows, the rest of NATO? The US. As Jim Gilmore, the US ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, puts it, all of Europe is under threat if Putin succeeds in Ukraine. And that becomes a direct threat to NATO and US national security. Now you might think Putin can't be foolish enough to believe he could possibly win against the US alone, let alone the entirety of NATO. And he can't, but don't forget who we're talking about. Like many other autocrats throughout history, Putin primarily surrounds himself with yes-men and loyalists. That's why his decision-making process may be insulated from diverse perspectives and critical voices. The echo chamber of loyalty and fear can lead to distorted assessments of reality and reckless decisions driven by overconfidence and hubris. Thus, despite the overwhelming odds against him in a direct confrontation with NATO, Putin's propensity for risk-taking and miscalculation could drive him to pursue such actions regardless. Unfortunately, in today's tense geopolitical climate, one miscalculation is enough to open the path to the most feared of all scenarios, World War III. That mere possibility of such a catastrophic war is a reason enough for NATO to stop Russia before it gets the chance to create conflict on a global scale. Ambassador Gilmore used the possibility of World War III to urge fellow conservatives to sign off on the $61 billion aid package to Ukraine, which was delayed in the US Congress for months. He said that conquering Russia is only phase 1, as Putin intends to reassemble the old Russian-Soviet Empire, and that Ukraine needs the aid to defend itself successfully and help avoid the Third World War. Russia's win in Ukraine would almost certainly be the trigger other authoritarian countries need to pursue their expansionist ambitions, whether emboldened by Russia or taking advantage of the ensuing chaos. This means China would almost certainly try to invade Taiwan, North Korea would gear for an attack against its number one enemy, South Korea, and Iran would likely intensify its efforts to exert influence across the Middle East. Interestingly, preventing escalation was one of the main reasons NATO was hesitant to fully stand behind Ukraine. That's why the alliance shot down any mention of sending NATO troops to Ukraine, establishing a no-fly zone, or even allowing Ukraine to use Western-supplied weapons against targets in Russia. But NATO seems to be waking up to the reality of the situation, realizing that an all-out war is more likely to happen if the alliance does nothing rather than actually get involved. That's why it's already started reversing some of the previous measures, like allowing Ukraine to use Western weapons on Russian soil. This brings us to the last reason why NATO must be the one to stop Russia. By now, the war in Ukraine has become personal to the organization. Sure, Ukraine isn't a NATO member. However, the principles NATO stands for, collective defense, sovereignty, and international stability, are directly threatened by Russia's actions in Ukraine. And remember, NATO is the most successful military alliance in history, having ensured peace and stability in Europe for almost 75 years. So what does a failure to prevent such a colossal threat in Europe say about this mighty organization? If Russia gets its own way, what is NATO even good for? These are the questions that NATO must confront head-on and answer decisively to uphold its credibility and purpose in the face of unprecedented challenges, and it must do it now. But why now? Or, to address the second part of the titular question in the video, why must NATO stop Russia now? NATO's immediate and decisive intervention is needed because Russia seems to be bouncing back from its losses at a rather unexpected rate. Months without crucial aid from the US have done immeasurable damage to Ukraine's war effort, allowing Russia to make significant territorial gains, especially in eastern Ukraine. Even though Russia has experienced massive losses since the beginning of the invasion, over 500,000 troops according to some estimates, the country's fighting force remains large and capable of continuing the conflict with substantial determination. This determination is likely to be displayed in full force in the ensuing summer of 2024, as military experts believe this is when Russia is planning a major offensive. In fact, some experts believe this offensive has already begun with the attacks on eastern Ukraine, especially Chasiv Yar and Avdiivka, getting more intense by the day. Others believe that Russia will use the 75th anniversary NATO summit in Washington, D.C., planned for July 9th to 11th, to launch this offensive. Such a brazen move would almost mock NATO for celebrating 75 years of existence, while the very country the alliance was created to contain wreaks havoc on its doorstep. But as critical as the situation is, what comes next might be even more alarming for the alliance. In May 2024, Putin dismissed Sergei Shoigu as Russia's Minister of Defense. Shoigu previously held this role for a staggering 12 years, during which he became one of Putin's closest allies. Shoigu was replaced with Deputy Prime Minister Andrei Belousov, an economist with almost no military experience. At first, this move might not make much sense. Why would Putin want someone lacking military experience as his Minister of Defense, especially during a time of heightened military operations? But then, Putin's intentions behind the move quickly become clear. He isn't worried about the current military operations. He's in it for the long run. Hiring an economist as Minister of Defense allows Putin to align the Russian economy with his war effort, present and future. In other words, Putin wants to ensure the Russian economy can sustain a prolonged war effort. This means that the longer NATO waits to intervene, the greater the risk that Russia will strengthen its economic and military capabilities, prolonging the conflict in Ukraine and likely expanding its ambitions beyond. However, it's important to note that the Russian threat will not simply dissipate even if NATO manages to prevent its victory in Ukraine. That's why the alliance must continue to bolster its defenses, reinforce its deterrence measures, and remain vigilant against Russian aggression. But first and foremost, it must fully become aware of the magnitude of the Russian threat. There's no doubt about it. Russia's aggression doesn't just affect Ukraine. In the past, regions like Chechnya, Georgia, and Syria have felt the devastating impact of this aggression. The indiscriminate civilian targeting, the torture, the deportations and disappearances. But we don't have to look at the past to see examples of Russia's mistreatment. Belarus has essentially become Russia's puppet state, and Serbia is on the path of receiving the same unflattering title. Russia maintains the so-called frozen conflict in countries like Armenia and Azerbaijan, exacerbating instability to suit its geopolitical aims. Moldova has all the precursors for one of Russia's seemingly favorite moves, invading a territory under the pretense of protecting Russian-speaking minorities. The country's pro-Russian breakaway province of Transnistria matches Russia's MO to a T. In addition, virtually no part of Europe is free from Russia's hybrid warfare operations. AI-enhanced disinformation campaigns, vicious cyber attacks, aggressive intelligence operations, you name it, and the nations from the Baltic to the Balkans have experienced it. Even the US has been heavily hit by Russia's propaganda machine. Russia's goal is to bring the West to its knees by dividing it, crushing its courage of conviction, and undermining its unity and resolve. At the same time, it's cultivating relations with unsavory regimes and non-state actors who are everything the West stands against. Hezbollah, Hamas, the Taliban, the Houthis. These are just some of the extremist organizations Putin has hosted or collaborated with so far. Talk about a meeting of the deranged minds. But if stopping Russia is as critical as the evidence suggests, why hasn't NATO done it already? Well, stopping one of the most powerful countries in the world isn't exactly an easy task, especially when the country in question is run by a ruthless and often careless leader like Putin, a leader who isn't above threatening a nuclear war if he doesn't get his way. That's right, Russia's constant nuclear blackmail has been one of the primary reasons NATO has been cautious about direct confrontation. After all, with almost 6,000 nuclear warheads in its arsenal, Russia is the largest nuclear power in the world. However, let's be honest, the size of the nuclear arsenal doesn't matter, as there are no winners in a nuclear war. All it takes is for a few nuclear weapons detonated for the entire world to be plunged into eternal darkness and the path of no return. But even if the worst-case scenario doesn't occur, pitting Russia directly against NATO could destabilize Europe for decades. No side would likely emerge unscathed, and the repercussions could haunt Europe for generations to come. Such a massive conflict would also take hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilian lives, which is why NATO has to tread so carefully. Unfortunately, even with everything that's at stake here, some political actors believe that NATO simply isn't doing enough to stop Russia. Even Zelensky, though eternally grateful for all the help, has often expressed frustration at the pace of NATO's response. He criticized NATO for not embracing Ukraine more and sending enough weapons to defend it. Latvian President Edgar Rinkevics pointed out the optics of NATO continuing on the same path. In an interview with Sky News, he said, "If Russia is not stopped from pushing the envelope, testing the limits, at one point it may consider that NATO is not serious about its own defense, and then we're in trouble." A similar sentiment was shared at a 21st of May Atlantic Council event, where John Herbst, the former US ambassador to Ukraine, emphasized that NATO's 75th anniversary event in Washington, D.C. shouldn't be a celebration, but a chance to adopt a crisis mentality. The president of the Center for European Policy Analysis, Alina Polyakova, added that an alliance that was awake would be on a war footing. Fogh Rasmussen, former Secretary General of NATO, and Andriy Yermak, head of the Office of the President of Ukraine, drove the point home by saying, "While we hesitated, Russia escalated. We must wake up." And "Russia is not going to stop. We have to stop it together." But with many doubting the alliance's toughness and resolve, how can NATO actually stop Russia, especially given how many opportunities for deterrence and collective action have been squandered already? There are a few scenarios NATO could consider. In Scenario 1, there's still some room for compromise. Stopping Russia's further advances will likely entail some territorial sacrifice on the Ukrainian part, but it's important to note that this territory wouldn't simply be given to Russia, but transformed into a demilitarized zone. This zone could be patrolled by the UN peacekeepers with supervision and potential assistance from Russian and Ukrainian police. To ensure Ukraine remains an independent state, several security arrangements would have to be set in place, including robust international monitoring and guarantees of sovereignty from NATO and other allied nations. To please Russia, Ukraine could pledge not to join NATO, and even forbid foreign troops on its soil. Of course, an additional incentive for Russia in Scenario 1 would be the unfreezing of its assets in the West and ending the many sanctions against the country. Now, if making any concessions to Putin after all the crimes he's committed in Ukraine seems disgraceful, you aren't alone in that option. But the truth is that the only way to stop Russia peacefully is to allow Putin to save face to some extent. Most importantly, such an agreement, though not fair in any way, would finally stop the massive destruction and loss of life in Ukraine, which should be NATO's #1 priority. Of course, many experts also believe that a peaceful resolution simply isn't possible anymore. In fact, they also believe that a negotiated settlement could only make things worse. Sure, it would momentarily end Russia's violence, save lives, and set Ukraine on a path to recovery, but for how long? The argument is that the war in Ukraine wouldn't simply disappear, but instead become a frozen conflict. And as you know, every frozen conflict can thaw at any time with devastating consequences. The unresolved tensions and territorial disputes might smolder for years, but once they flare up again, they threaten to plunge the region into an even more violent war. That's why scenario number 2 leaves no room for compromise. According to proponents of this scenario, Putin won't stop until he either destroys Ukraine altogether or at least reduces it to a puppet state under Russian control. At the same time, Zelensky has also rejected any possibility of ceding territory or even directly negotiating with Russia. In such circumstances, the only viable solution for stopping Russia is defeating Putin once and for all. This entails going all out in building up Ukraine's defenses, mobilizing additional troops and resources for the country, and even admitting it to NATO. In other words, it involves fully embracing Ukraine, which is what Zelensky asked the alliance to do in the first place. But to truly defeat Putin, NATO mustn't only keep Russia's power in mind. It must also account for the power of its potential allies like China and Iran. Ever since Russia became isolated on the global stage, it's increasingly started to turn to these two countries for help. There have been numerous technology transfers, sanction breaches, and joint military exercises that help Russia stay afloat, even when shunned by most of the world. Iran has also been supplying Russia with kamikaze drones and ballistic missiles to bolster its military capabilities and maintain its aggressive posture. Since these three countries are bound together by an anti-US attitude, it shouldn't be surprising that North Korea is also frequently in the mix, essentially bringing all the worst actors across the globe together. But as alarming as this unofficial alliance is, with all its unlawfulness and nuclear weapons, the US-led NATO mustn't shy away from addressing it directly if Russia is to be defeated. Unlike Putin, the US leadership doesn't allow any miscalculations to compromise global security and peace. But this leaves us with one more question. If NATO is well aware that a peaceful resolution is a no-go, isn't Russia aware of it too? And if so, is there a possibility that the country will strike first before NATO gets a chance to do the same? Let's not sugarcoat the answer. The prospect of a preemptive strike by Russia, driven by the desire to seize the initiative, is always a possibility. Essentially, Russia would try to dismantle NATO before the alliance has the chance to stop its vicious war effort. The proponents of this scenario believe that the 2024 US presidential elections might mark the beginning of Russia's actions against NATO. That is, if Donald Trump gets re-elected as president. You see, Trump has been highly critical of NATO for years, primarily for its over-reliance on the US. He's also talked about reducing the US's contributions to the alliance and even pulling the country out altogether. Naturally, this would be a major hit to NATO, which indeed heavily relies on the US for funding, military strength, and leadership. This potential shift in US policy could embolden Russia, seeing an opportunity to strike while NATO is in disarray. The vacuum left by a diminished US presence would create instability, leaving NATO's European members scrambling to fill the gap. This scenario, feared by many, underscores the critical importance of maintaining a united front against Russia's aggression. It also puts pressure on NATO to demonstrate it would still retain superiority over Russia even without US involvement. And it's true, NATO would still be superior to Russia even if the US exited the alliance. How is this possible? Well, the war in Ukraine has absolutely wrecked Russia's military capabilities. As a result, the country has been forced to dig in its stocks and pull out outdated Soviet-era equipment that doesn't stand a chance against sophisticated Western technology. And let's not forget, Russia is practically surrounded by NATO. There's no buffer zone and no capability to successfully defend the home front. Finally, after 2 years of war, Russia simply lacks the economic stability to wage a war against some of the mightiest economic powerhouses in Europe. As many as 4 NATO countries, Germany, the UK, France, and Italy, have stronger economies than Russia. When combined together, their gross domestic product is 6 times higher than Russia's. Now adding the remaining 28 NATO allies into the mix, and you'll immediately realize just how inferior Russia is to NATO in every regard. Russia is no longer the power it once was, so it's abundantly clear who would come out on top. Still, some top officials believe that no scenario should be completely written off. For instance, Gabrielius Landsbergis, Lithuania's Minister of Foreign Affairs, emphasizes that his country must be ready to defend itself no matter the circumstances. Landsbergis hopes that Lithuania's preparations will be enough to send a message to its friends and partners in Europe, in NATO, that they have to take the Russian threat seriously. Lithuania, together with the remaining 2 Baltic states Latvia and Estonia, has also been working on building a common Baltic defense zone on their borders with Russia and Belarus. This project will entail building 600 bunkers along Estonia's 210-mile border with Russia, worth some $64 million. From this data alone, it's abundantly clear most NATO allies are taking the Russian threat extremely seriously and doing all in their power to be ready for any scenario. But which scenario do you think will take place? Do you still have trust that NATO can stop Russia? Or do you believe that the alliance's mild actions against Russia have damaged its credibility and authority beyond repair? Share your opinions in the comments section below. Now go and check out NATO warns of all-out war with Russia by this year, or click this other video instead.